Hi, I'm Ricky Robertson. I'm an educator and author. I work with schools in developing social, emotional, and behavioral supports for students, especially those impacted by adverse childhood experiences and trauma. In today's session, we're going to explore some of the ways that adverse childhood experiences, toxic stress, and trauma impact children's brain development. I'm going to be sharing a story in this session that's going to include some references to child abuse and neglect. And so I want to begin by inviting you to care for your well-being as needed. If today's not the day for you to hear a story like this, maybe set aside the video and view it at another time. I'm going to begin with a story that's a true story from when I was working with an elementary school, and I want to talk about two students in that elementary school. The first student, I'm going to call her Melissa, and I'm changing her name on purpose to protect her identity. And Melissa was in 5th grade, and she had very severe behaviors. When she was escalated, Melissa would yell, scream, curse, throw things, physically aggress against her teacher, physically aggress against other students. There were times when Melissa would get so escalated, so upset, that she would go out into the middle of the 5th grade hallway and intentionally urinate in the middle of the hallway. It was impossible for anyone in that entire wing of the building to teach when Melissa was having a bad day. Now that's Melissa. Melissa's in 5th grade. There's another student in the school I'm going to talk about, and we'll call her Sarah. And Sarah was in 4th grade. Now, Sarah was a delight to teach. She was very helpful. She was strong academically. She loved to have classroom jobs. In fact, she would come to school early just to water the plants in her teacher's classroom. And one day, Sarah's teacher called down to the office, and she said, "Sarah asked to use the restroom. She's been gone for quite a while. I'm a little concerned. Would someone go look for her?" So 2 of the women working in the front office, they were checking the restrooms around the school, and I was walking around the outside of the school, and I found this little girl crouched behind a portable, and she was just pulling her hair, hitting herself in the head, saying, "Stupid, stupid." And what we learned was that every time Sarah would get back an assignment, and if she hadn't done as well as she had hoped, she'd ask to go use the restroom, but she'd actually hide somewhere and self-harm. Now, this is a true story, and believe it or not, Sarah and Melissa are sisters. And when Melissa was in kindergarten, her behavior was even more severe, and her kindergarten teacher contacted the counselor contacted the family, and there ended up being a Child Protective Services investigation. And it was learned that these 2 young girls were raised by 2 parents who were heavily addicted to opiates. And the parents would lock the girls in a bedroom for several hours, up to days at a time. They'd put in a leftover box of pizza or food, and the 2 girls would urinate and defecate in the corner of the room. This story, though difficult to hear, also provides us some very valuable insights into the impacts of trauma and adversity. Here we have 2 young women who've experienced similar forms of trauma and severe abuse and neglect during similar stages of brain development from birth to ages 4 and 5. When as much as 80 to 90% of the brain is developing. And yet they responded to those traumas in very different ways. So on one end of the spectrum, we have a student like Melissa, who's more externalizing. We see her engage in more of those aggressive behaviors, defiance, disrespect, etc. And students don't necessarily have to have experienced as severe a form of trauma and neglect as Melissa experienced to exhibit many of those behaviors. In fact, there are times when I've actually worked with students with very challenging behaviors when I was a behavior intervention specialist with a school district, and I sometimes found that students with very severe externalizing behaviors, they weren't experiencing the same forms of abuse or neglect. They actually had parents that were incredibly permissive, that were giving their kids whatever they wanted, kind of letting them run the show at home. And I actually think that, and this might be a controversial opinion, but that excessively permissive parenting, trying to be your kid's best friend, not establishing appropriate structure and boundaries, is actually a form of emotional abuse and neglect. Children need those boundaries and that structure in order to feel safe. But I'm speaking to the fact that when we have students that have these more externalizing and challenging behaviors, the disrespect, the defiance, the kid who refuses to take no for an answer, etc., many of these students are in a double bind. Because on some level, they feel like in order for me to be safe, I need to be in control. I need to get my way. But the hard part is, if you have a kid who's always getting their way, always getting what they want, doesn't ever have to hear no, or always gets their way if they have a tantrum or a meltdown, etc., then you can end up with, in the case of Melissa, an 11-year-old girl who's running a school, who's more powerful than all the adults in the building. But the scary thing for a child who has that much power and control is that if they ever need help, who are they going to turn to? So their anxiety actually increases the more control they get because there's no one providing any boundary, any structure, any real sense of safety. That's why being trauma-informed is not about being permissive. It's about being connected and firm, holding students in positive regard, with empathy, with compassion, building positive relationships, while also being firm, having clear boundaries, structure, restorative discipline practices, being able to hold a student in positive regard while also holding them accountable, helping them to take action to repair harm while also building new skills to prevent those behaviors from happening again. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have students like Sarah, and believe me, you can have the same student go from one extreme to the other, or find themselves somewhere in the middle. But in the case of Sarah and Melissa, Sarah was primarily on the end of students that are more internalizing. So a lot of her symptoms of exposure to trauma and adversity, a lot of those symptoms weren't so readily observable in the classroom. They manifested more in anxiety, perfectionism, people-pleasing behaviors, and ultimately by hiding and engaging in self-harm. So we can have students that have multiple ACEs, but they might come to school every day and do what they're asked when they're asked. In fact, these students I really worry about because they're at the greatest risk for slipping through the cracks. I had a teacher say to me, this was in June of a school year, she said, "Ricky, I can tell you what my students with severe behaviors had for dinner last night. There's a third of my students who I hardly know. And it's the ones who are the most compliant, who follow my rules." So one of the most important things for us to do is to conduct a relationship inventory, to look at the students on our roster or to look at our students throughout our entire school and make sure that every single student is connected to at least one adult in the building, that every student is known by name and by need. Those supportive relationships are important for students, whether they're internalizing or externalizing, whether they've experienced trauma and adversity or not. We know that they're incredibly important for buffering against exposure to toxic stress and trauma and supporting a young person's resilience. I want to talk, though, about the fact that the behaviors that we see in this example of Sarah and Melissa are really just the tip of the iceberg. So many of the challenging behaviors that we see in our classrooms are actually symptoms of difficulties in neurological functioning, in how the brain is wired and wiring itself and how it's functioning. When children are exposed to high doses of trauma and adversity, it triggers the stress response system. It triggers that child's metabolic, hormonal, neurological stress response systems, flooding the body with cortisol, with adrenaline, with stress hormones. It triggers the brainstem region, the survival centers of the brain, and evokes what's considered a fight, flight, or freeze response. Or what some people, to quote Pete Walker, who kind of coined the phrase in his book Complex PTSD, a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, which is kind of what we saw with Sarah, that desire to appease and to please others, but in turn sacrificing the self and our own needs. When a child is in that survival brain, when the amygdala is activated, when the brainstem region is hyper-aroused, when they're in that state of fight, flight, or freeze, let's just think for a moment about what that could look like in the classroom. We might see fight behaviors like defiance, disrespect, being argumentative, aggression. We might see flight or freeze behaviors like shutting down, not speaking, even running out of the classroom. Or some of those fawn behaviors, the student who is overwhelmed by anxiety and perfectionism. It's also important to recognize that when that brainstem region is hyperactivated, it disrupts functioning in the prefrontal cortex and temporal lobes, making it difficult for a child to manage their emotions, to communicate effectively. to manage impulses, to engage in tasks that require executive functioning skills. Those regions of the brain are literally offline, so to speak, because the brain has kind of been hijacked by the amygdala and the brainstem region. So how do we respond? How do we help a student when they're in that space of dysregulation? And how do we help them to regulate, to integrate their prefrontal cortex and temporal lobes to support a healthy functioning of the brain? It's going to take time. It's going to take consistent effort. It involves helping students to learn new skills to get their needs met in healthier ways. And it's important to keep in mind what we've just spoken about in terms of trauma and the brain, because that can give us some valuable insight into how to best support these students in these difficult moments. Thankfully, we have what's referred to as the neurosequential model of the brain, thanks to the work of folks like Dr. Bruce Perry and Dr. Dan Siegel, which helps us to understand that when that student is dysregulated, when they're having that amygdala hijack and that brainstem region is hyperactivated, one of the first things we need to do is help that student to regulate, to find their calm, to calm that brainstem region. And it's not going to be helpful to try to lecture that student or to use a lot of words, because the parts of their brain that would help them with communication and reasoning, they can't even access them in that moment. So the first thing we might do is we might take deep breaths, or we might speak in few words but in a calm, reassuring tone, or we might even have worked with that student ahead of time to learn some strategies to manage difficult feelings and emotions and to practice those strategies when they're calm, so that in those moments of dysregulation, they have some tools in their toolkit. There also might be some things that we don't do. So for a student with behaviors as severe as Melissa, I would often observe her behaviors and really map out her escalation cycles so that everyone who works with her understands what to do and what not to do, so that we don't accidentally make matters worse and further dysregulate her in times of difficulty, so that there's a clear kind of behavioral plan in place. But in the moment, we first focus on helping that child to regulate and find their calm. Then we listen, and that's when we relate. How are you feeling? What are you thinking right now? And then we listen to their side of the story. We listen to what they're thinking or feeling. We don't have to argue. We don't have to validate and agree with everything they say. We're simply reflecting back to them and acknowledging what we're hearing. We're soothing that limbic system, that amygdala, that emotionally charged region of the brain by helping that young child to feel heard. They might even draw us a picture of what they're thinking or feeling, or express it in other ways. But we're just there to acknowledge the emotions, the thoughts, and the perspectives that we're hearing. And then we can access and move into that prefrontal cortex and helping that child to reason, to problem solve. What could we do to repair this situation? What could we do to prevent it from happening again? And so in that neurosequential model, we help to regulate, relate, and then reason. But it's important to keep in mind that when we look at the impacts of trauma on the brain, we also then have clues on how to best support students to regulate and integrate the regions of their brains in healthy ways. And the beautiful thing is that, again, our past is not our destiny. Even the brain is wired for resilience. We have this amazing ability of neuroplasticity, the capacity of the brain to change in response to its environment throughout our lifespan. And so when you're helping a child to learn new skills to get their needs met in healthier ways, you are helping to rewire their brain in ways that will benefit them now and throughout the rest of their life. That's an incredible contribution, and a testament to the power of the brain to be wired for resilience.
The Trauma-Informed Teaching Series is made possible by a partnership between the National Education Association and WETA. For more information, please visit adlit.org/trauma.